Hi, I'm Owen from Rask Australia. Thanks for tuning in to the Rask Network. Before we get into today's show, there are a few things we have to go over. Firstly, what you're about to hear and see is limited to general information only. It's not personal financial advice like you get from a financial planner. Also, it's important to remember that past performance is not indicative of future performance. That means that anything that's happened in the past, or we say today, is not necessarily going to reflect what happens in the future. Lastly, please consider that any of the guests or myself are featuring on this program may have a financial interest in some of the products or shares mentioned. That's enough from me. I hope you enjoyed today's program.
G'day, welcome to the Australian Property Podcast. Hello, thanks for joining us today. This is our 2 cents segment. We're on a mission to become Australia's most trusted property podcast. G'day, Chris Bates. How's it going, Chris?
Pete, doing very well, mate. What's happening over in the UK? How are you doing?
Just watching the cricket today and the British Open golf as well, starting this week. So it's all happening. The weather's been a bit mixed though, so hopefully that can hold off. So we get a result in the cricket one way or the other. How about yourself? How's your week been?
It's been good. I hurt my hand at futsal last night, so lucky I don't do a job that I need to use my hands too much. It was we won the game, so that's all that matters. How long are you staying in the UK for? Are you heading back here anytime soon?
I am indeed, because we've got the Rask Roadshow coming up very soon. So don't forget to book your tickets. We'll put a link in the show notes. We're doing the roadshow all around the country, Victoria, Perth, Adelaide. I'm speaking at a couple of the New South Wales events and in Sydney. So I'll be on a plane fairly soon. So hopefully the cricket goes our way, and then it'll be a more enjoyable flight home. So forgive my ignorance, but what is futsal? Is that just
futsal's like indoor, but it's played outdoor. It's like a five-a-side soccer, football, but it's over 35s, and you'd be surprised how much people want to win in that game. It's amazing. It's very fast-paced.
You still get injured.
Yeah, and you definitely get injured because it's a pretty hard surface. So I got away with one last night. It could be a lot worse than it was. But what else is happening with work, Pete? Any purchases happening in Brisbane? What's happening?
Yes, we did get a purchase over the line this week in Brisbane, just around about the $1 million price point in the north side suburbs of Brisbane. So it's been an interesting year. We're talking about the housing downturn, but there just hasn't been that much stock, and that's really underpinned the market, especially in Brisbane. I think there's a real shortage, certainly of quality housing available, and actually a bit of an undersupply as well. So the apartment market's been strong. So it's always good. It feels good to get them across the line, because it's been a hard slog sometimes actually getting properties purchased. How about you? You seeing the same thing?
Yeah, it's a very similar story, right? I mean, we've had a lot of purchases, not a lot, a handful in the last week under $1 million. We also had one very close to $10 million in the lower north shore of Sydney. So we had the two extremes. We haven't been doing many over that sort of 1.5 to 2. We usually do quite a high percentage of clients in that space. And that's because there's been a big freeze of the market. It's been very low stock, which is what you're talking about. And your other point around people in the apartment market staying strong, absolutely. We're seeing this dial down of budgets because of borrowing capacities, but also because people are a little bit more apprehensive of having bigger mortgages because of higher interest rates and the uncertainty around that. It's going to be interesting because there's definitely a bit of stress and pain with mortgages at the moment. We haven't got we've got one client on a payment holiday out of 1,000, let's call it. But we've definitely got quite a few clients coming to us who are looking at options on how to stay in their homes and how they're going to manage payments when they come off fixed. And, there's things like maternity leave coming, and maybe the bonuses didn't come that they're expecting if they were in, say, the construction industry, et cetera. So, there's definitely a lot of concern, but people are getting ahead of it. They're not just going and defaulting on their loan and missing payments. They're thinking about things wisely. Like, how can I do this? What's my alternative? What's my options of getting through this storm? And especially with homes, investors are a bit different. We are seeing quite a few clients that are potentially selling investments that they plan to keep longer term, but they also go, well, it's actually not a bad decision to sell because they can recycle their debt, pay off their home, which is a high interest rate, and then re-borrow in time for a debt restructuring purpose as well. So, yeah, lots happening at work. There's lots of people redoing numbers and, touching base. So let's get into it, Pete. What's our 3 stories this week?
Yeah, that's certainly showing up in the numbers, isn't it? More investors selling. And I think generally lenders are very keen to work with stressed borrowers these days. They're not really that incentivized to push home buyers or borrowers to the wall, forcing defaults or forced sales. So it's good to hear that people are getting on the front foot and being proactive there. So the big three stories this week. Firstly, construction costs finally easing in the second quarter of 2023. So we'll take a look at that. And I think there's still some uncertainty here about what happens ahead, Chris, given all the infrastructure spend, build to rent coming online and all of that. So we'll have a look at that. Secondly, new Reserve Bank of Australia governor has been announced, Michelle Bullock, first female governor, which attracted a lot of media for being the first female governor, but also more interesting to have a think about what's ahead for monetary policy. So we'll take a look at that. And then thirdly, a couple of news articles this week talking about the international student intake, which is rocketed back over the past year, adding to the housing shortage pressures, with the IPA saying that 70% of new housing is being occupied by international students. Now, whether or not that's quantifiable is a different question, but certainly an interesting subject for debate. So should we start with the construction costs, Chris, and take a look at that?
Yeah, let's definitely kick off with what the story is about, Pete, because I've definitely got some, other thoughts. I've been speaking to clients, and some articles came out yesterday from Charter Keck, which was really interesting as well. So, yeah, what did you read about?
Well, the Cordell Construction Cost Index, which is now comes under the CoreLogic umbrella, construction cost growth was 0.7% in the quarter. So that's the lowest since 2020, and actually now below the decade average. Normally, construction costs go up by a little bit more than 1% per quarter. And residential building activity from the ABS, I mean, that's running at about $15 billion a quarter now. So that's down about 20% from the highs. Now, it's worth considering why that's the case when we've got record high population growth. Well, firms are going bust, insolvencies. Some developers are selling off projects to concentrate on lower risk developments. Also, there's been capacity constraints like shortages of materials, trades. There's been delays. But I think there's another factor at play, Chris, and that's that the non-residential construction sector, things like infrastructure projects, really strong and growing. So that's adding some pressures, I guess, or extra challenges for the residential sector, and also some major build-to-rent approvals just getting across the line, especially in Melbourne, Lend-Lease and Daiwa. They're big projects being approved. So that's basically it. So far anyway, construction cost growth, I mean, prices are still going up, but they're not going up at the mad rate that they were previously. So I guess on one level, this is really good news for inflation because construction costs were one of the main drivers of inflation over the past year or two. But still, I would say some uncertainty about what actually happens next, given we've got record high population growth and also big infrastructure spend still ongoing.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting space, right? I think that it depends on what you're building and whether your costs are going up. The materials you'll need could be different, right? And so I was chatting to a client exec at a massive construction company this week, and they build lots of different areas, but this is the industrial segment, and he was saying that the prices are definitely still going up. They can't get any certainty on what costs are going to be next year. And they only really know till the end of this year. They kind of buy it on, forward pricing, maybe 6 months they can lock in prices, but not longer than that. Everyone's been burnt in the construction industry's profits are, and the sort of sinking fund, the little buffer fund that construction companies know that if a project goes bad, hey, we've got this money. They've really used that sinking fund, right? And I think not, and that's why firms are going, bust, because they didn't have a sinking fund or it wasn't enough. And I think that risk taking, this really should be a moment where, if you wanted to build, you want to build into high population growth and very low supply when everyone else isn't building, you're more likely, but they can't get their projects off the ground. And Charter Keck put an interesting article together this week, and he was basically, I think it was Richard there, he's a good man, but he was saying that prices were going to go up by 25% on build to sell to make it worthwhile. So, they're going to have to put these projects to market at 25% above what they've been doing in the past to make it worthwhile, and have to see if the market buys them. And that just shows that the margins are just not there to build. I think it's going to be interesting. We're not seeing many clients doing renovations. So and we don't do much in the new build space and the off the plan space. So we don't really know what's happening there and new townhouses and things like that. But people looking to renovate their homes and doing significant renovations, that's fallen off a cliff compared to 2 years ago. Getting access to equity, the desire to do it under higher interest rates, the cost to build, they're just not really even considering it. If they are considering it, they're doing a much cut down version, something just to make it more livable or to get, if they're running out of space, etc. So, I do think there's going to be some real value out in doing builds in areas that are great and tick a lot of the lifestyle benefits, but those areas are usually hard to build in, right, Pete? We usually do builds in pockets like high rise or greenfield estates or middle and outer rings. We do townhouses. It's not usually in those quintessential pockets where we're massively undersupplied.
Yes, the latest ABS figures showed about 46,000 dwellings commenced in the March quarter. So that's off the cycle lows, but it's still pretty low when you think about it, especially with population growth running probably at 600,000 or so. The interesting thing is there's still, officially anyway, 240,000 dwellings under construction. I don't know where these all are. It's hard to, I drive around the country a lot. I just don't know where this 240,000 is coming from, but apparently still over 100,000 detached homes under construction around the country, but they're just not being delivered. Actually, activity over the last quarter was down, so we're just not getting the completions through. So I guess, potentially some good news with cost pressures finally easing. Interesting you mentioned the Charter Kramer article there. I always read what those guys have to say, especially Scott. They just have some really great insights. The reason I mention is about 2 or 3 months ago, I wrote a sort of an opinion piece where I said new apartment prices are going to have to go up 25% before anyone's going to build. I mean, the cost of delivering medium density housing since 2019 has gone through the roof, and I just can't see it. But we'll get some projects through, particularly I think some of the more sort of luxury projects, but actually en masse, getting big supply through, I just don't think it's going to happen until there's more certainty and prices are rising, especially with the cost of capital. So onto your point, Chris, about location. So there was a McGrath article actually out this week talking about the location and position of properties, of how sought after streets or streets within those areas are really the number one driver of demand for housing. And they went through a range of factors or variables that actually could change the price of property. So things like living close to water, obviously, things like aspect. So like north-facing dwellings could be worth 20 to 25% more. Other things they looked at, new infrastructure, sort of a village location. So did you ever run through that, and what were your thoughts?
Yeah, I do think it was an interesting article. I mean, McGrath's offices are, targeted towards the more affluent parts of our city, right? So, I guess he's talking to his market, which is people within those markets. But absolutely, what he's talking about here is what drives prices is the livability or the lifestyle benefit attached to those properties. And people will pay more if it offers greater lifestyle or greater benefits. And so I think, he made it one of the good points. I do like the line in it. It said, if you are considering the identified a suburb to buy in, but your budget limits you to the less popular streets in that area, I'd suggest reconsidering. Look at the surrounding suburbs and buying the best streets there instead. Instead, buying a great position in a great suburb than a poor position in a great suburb. And I do think that's really true because, there are risks involved buying the poorer properties even within great suburbs. You can get oversupply in downturns. You can overpay in hot markets. And so you can really you have to be a bit more luck to play in that market versus you're just buying into a good suburb and you're buying good land. You made some great points around the aspect. It's been a frustrating thing. I'm just seeing real estate agents misusing north-facing all the time, even the McGrath agent. So he should be, pulling the whip out on his agents here to basically say, no, we need to set the standard and we can't call something north-facing if it's south-facing. North-facing is to the rear where you spend your living. You want to be getting the sun to where you actually spend time in the property. You don't want to be getting sun on the front porch and on that nice chair that you never go sit on. Infrastructure, I think, it's got to be careful here trying to predict infrastructure and buy before infrastructure. I'm up on the beaches. If people thought the beaches tunnel was going to get built and they bought up here thinking that's going to happen, well, that got canned. just last year. I do think the village matters more now, right? Like the work from home hybrid movement, that sort of escapism from your home office, just to pop up and grab a coffee. And, maybe in the morning you've got extra time just to spend up there and, grab a brekkie or, walk your kids to school, which maybe you would have rushed to the city. I think that village is, really even more important now. So I just think it's a good article just to get people to think about, what really drives prices is its livability, and even a suburb, within a suburb, different parts of the suburb have different benefits.
So you have to take a compass to the open homes to work out which is the right aspect. Yeah, I definitely agree on the village point. I would pay more for a property where I could walk to a local coffee shop or cafe. Look at a place like Sunshine Beach in the Noosa Shire. It's just so popular. People love being able to walk to the beach, little shopping village, a couple of nice cafes and restaurants and bars. It's just a really handy thing. Chris, I've got one question here before we move on. The article sort of said, yes, like a new roadway, tunnel or rail links can add 30% to home values in a short period of time. I guess I understand here the point being, if you buy in an area that was previously not connected and then it becomes better connected, then that can see an uplift to the value of your home. Here's my question though. So their point is on the aspect, north-facing will often outperform south-facing by 20 to 25% in value, which, yes, I get it if you're selling the property. So they were saying, with a house, you want a north aspect to the rear. So the backyard and the main living areas are nice and bright, plenty of natural light. And with apartments, you want the indoor and outdoor living areas to be facing north for the same reasons. Now, here's my question. Let's say you've got a property, for the sake of round numbers, it's $1 million, but then there's another one that's north facing and it's 1.2. Now, does this actually matter for you as the buyer, just from a pure numbers perspective? Because presumably, let's say sometime in the future, the property market has doubled. You've got a property that's not north facing that's selling for 2 million, but the north facing one has still got that 20% premium. Does that actually make any difference? Or are things like gentrification, is that more important for price performance?
Look, I probably take a bit of grain of salt in the percentages here, because I think they're maybe a little bit optimistic, right? I don't think they're that big. But I would say as the property suburb medium increases, I would say that people are willing to pay more for the additional lifestyle benefits, because you start moving more and more up the pyramid, I guess. And so let's say it's a quintessential AAA, high net worth suburb like a Mossman, for example. I could absolutely see that if you get a dream block that's a north facing there, that's got the views, and that's much, people absolutely will pay because they've got the ability to. And those properties won't turn over. If you go down the spectrum and you go more and more down into the sub, I don't think people have got the budgets to pay for this. And I don't think people will, because they'll change their suburb. I think they'll say, well, if I could buy in a better suburb for 1.2 versus $1 million, I'll go and buy south facing in a better suburb. So I don't think these benefits matter as much in the lower part of the market. But I do think as they go up the median price, and suburbs shift median prices, right? That's how prices go up. The demand in a suburb can shift through gentrification, I would say. And those buyers before didn't want those things. They didn't want the big houses. They didn't want the views. But now all of a sudden it's a new buyer coming that have been pushed out of other suburbs, and then they're valuing these things. And so they've got the ability to pay for them. So I think the numbers you use are too big. But I do think that the purpose of the article, and I think from a capital growth point of view, I do think that, you are more protected if you buy a property that's not compromised, right? And so you've got to be careful taking on two compromises. If it's south facing plus it's a busy road, well, good luck trying to sell it in this market, right? And if you potentially try to buy that property in a hot market, you potentially overpaid because you didn't pay enough. Didn't get it for enough of a discount to the premium properties. And but if you buy that property that isn't compromised, like it's not a busy road and maybe has got good aspects, and it's a decent size block, and a decent type of block, then in this market, if you try to sell it, well, there's not many of those on the market. You probably still get a better price. And so that's just the issue with buying properties that have, not got the things that buyers really want, is you are a bit at the mercy of the market when you sell. And no one knows when they're going to sell. Death, divorce, lifestyle shifts, kids, financial difficulty, life decision change. You don't really know when you're going to sell your home. You think you do, but people's lives change.
I think you've answered my question. Yeah, scarcity matters, especially, I guess, as you move up the price points. And yes, I mean, Australia's population today is 26 million, but one day it'll be 36 million. And yeah, also the cycle thing is important. Various points in the cycle, if you've got a compromised property, not easy to rent, not easy to sell. So yes, certainly pay attention to those aspects to the extent that the budget allows. I guess there's often this question about whether busy roads in the future might be quieter with electric vehicles, but let's park that one for another day. So Chris, second story, new Reserve Bank governor. So Philip Lowe, maybe not that surprisingly, given all of the media coverage, has got his marching orders. New appointment, Michelle Bullock, maybe a political aspect to this possibly. Now, Michelle Bullock's been a central banker for 4 decades and she's a Reserve Bank insider. So to me, this suggests continuity rather than a dramatic reform or change of approach. So generally by financial markets considered a safe bet, some stability, which is probably welcomed by markets. So there will be some changes, 8 meetings a year instead of 11. But I think more generally, just it's a nicer time to take over. I think we've seen this week, UK inflation fell by much more than expected. New Zealand inflation down from 6.7 to 6%. So it looks like disinflation is happening not only in the US and Canada, but also now UK, New Zealand, and presumably Australia is going to follow. So what did you make of it? Any key takeaways?
Look, I think, the world constantly surprises us every year, right? So maybe it's a nicer time to take over right now because we know what's happened in the last 7 years. But I think, we don't know what's going to happen in the next 7 years. And, when we look, because I think it's a 7-year term, correct me if I'm wrong, but, if it's 7 years from now, so in the past, 2016, so you had a proper property boom, you had to slow this down. Then you had a Sydney housing market crash, you had the Royal Commission, you had a change of potential government in 2019, you had a real tightening of lending, they cut rates at the same time that borrowing capacity went up. Then they had the whole COVID situation. I mean, who knows what's coming in the next 7 years? I think that's what makes life interesting, to be honest. And so, yeah, I think it's a good time to come on. But, she's got a lot of heat on her, to be honest, because, households are hurting. And if the inflation does stay sticky, which leads into our, this discussion really, if she's going to be the one that's, RBA matters a lot right now, more than it probably did ever in the past. Maybe in the 90s, it was a big problem, right? So, yeah, it's an interesting job at the moment. You are probably on the chop. There's no easy way at the moment. People they don't really value you when you're cutting rates, but they really hurt, target you when you're increasing rates.
I believe there's much more scrutiny these days. I think it's largely because of online media and social media. Look, everyone's always had opinions, but now literally every man and his dog has an opinion on what the Reserve Bank should or shouldn't be doing. They always say never read their comments underneath articles, but there's some wild stuff out there. But yeah, there's challenges, as you said, households under stress. I think one of the key challenges at the moment is high population growth. And I think this has been alluded to by the outgoing governor. There's putting pressure on infrastructure, housing supply. Looks like there's a real critical apartment undersupply in some areas, and that's not going to be solved anytime soon. And this could actually reignite inflation. I mean, who really knows? As you said, there's an unpredictable element to all of this stuff. And yes, inflation's been falling in all these other countries, but we've got very high population growth and we've got plenty of challenges still to be navigated. And I guess, as you said, if you're potentially going to oversee a stretch as governor, you're quite likely to see at least a per capita recession, if not a full recession, as well as an upturn and a recovery. So there's plenty of interesting stuff ahead. Market pricing has calmed down quite a bit this week. The terminal rate, as I look here today, 4.35. So that's basically saying one more interest rate hike and then done for the cycle. Obviously, this is a movable feast, and there's a couple of key figures to be released before the next meeting. So yeah, we'll see how that one plays out. So Chris, this third news story of the week, students take housing shortage to the next level, which actually does tie in to the population growth point. So we've got a near record student intake, more than 500,000 visas issued in financial year 2023, up from about 400,000 last year. And this is obviously following the lull during COVID. So we don't have this massive snapback. Now, I guess this is a two-pronged issue. So it's good for labour shortages, and it will certainly take the pressure off things like wages growth, because students can fill many of those sort of roles that were in short supply, things like retail, hospitality, and so on. But it does add to the strain on the housing supply. Now, the IPA claimed this week that students occupy 70% of new housing in the 2023 financial year. So, yes, there's lots of longer-term benefits of bringing in international students and then graduates, sort of younger people who will pay tax for a long time. They reduce the dependency ratio, improve the skills. But, and yes, obviously we're forging links with Asia, particularly India, China, and countries like that. But it does have an issue at the moment in particular. Hearing more people talk about high population growth just because of those pressures on things like infrastructure, roads, and especially housing.
Yeah, I think we've got to be careful with, what's the kill the goose that lays the golden eggs, right? And, look what's been our success story over, generations, I would say, is that, the lifestyle benefits of living in Australia, and you've got demographic issues, which we've spoken about across the world. And, just because people have wanted to move here in the past doesn't mean that we want that in the future. And so, yeah, we definitely got to be careful managing this, but we don't want to say shut the doors and no, unis can't have any overseas students, right? Because all of a sudden it gives an opportunity to a lot of countries around the world that will take those students, and maybe we'll be wishing in a few years' time that we didn't do that, right? I think, I think there is some positive signs with inflation around the world, right, Pete? I think on your last point, I think is that New Zealand starting to look much better. The Canada, the US has got under 3% as well. So, if we're on that trajectory, then, things are looking better. The whole new, students, the money that comes in for the university, their family come, and then the tourism money, the family may move here, they stay here. We haven't needed that 20-year-old. We didn't have to put them through university and childcare, but all of a sudden they're a productive person of our labour force if they stick around. So, I don't know. It's a touchy one, this, right, Pete? But if we're importing too many people and talent, I guess, people who are working, and we haven't got enough housing, then we're going to have other pressures. Maybe the infrastructure and our public transport pressures aren't there because of the hybrid work. I think that's really eased a lot of that pressure, which, Gladys was really worried about that back in, pre-COVID, right? We need to slow down Sydney because our infrastructure can't handle it, our roads and our trains, but COVID sort of slowed that down.
Yeah, this has been an ongoing issue. So the previous coalition government had the uncapped international student working hours, which I think was important at the time. But there was an issue with people sort of saying, well, students are coming on student visas, but really it's a sort of a backdoor work visa situation. The current government's extended post-study work rights. So now, a lot of people are saying, well, the student visa is effectively more like a long-term residency visa, even though the take-up historically hasn't been as high as you might expect. But it does seem there's been a shift of focus, I think, particularly towards India. I wonder whether the falling population in China and the cooling relationship politically with China, that's seeing the Labour government has certainly been spending a lot of time sort of angling for more Indian students and building pathways there for migration. So, yeah, there's a lot happening there. I mean, the IPA figures, they project a net housing shortage of 252,800 dwellings by 2028. I love that these forecasts are so accurate down to the nearest dwelling. But, I mean, you can't predict net surpluses and shortages that accurately because people the population is much more flexible, and we're seeing at the moment massive increase in the number of people applying for a flat share, with websites like flatmates.com.au. So the number of dwellings isn't necessarily the key indicator here. It's actually the way people use the dwelling stock. But I think the overarching point is there's a lot of pressure on housing. We're not building it quickly enough, and we've got a lot of people coming in, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think the hospitality industry, domestic services, a lot of jobs that people do when they are studying. nanny services. That there's lots of things that I think that international students do while they're studying, and good on them for wanting to live in, to move to Australia and create a life and have a family, I think. And if it does create issues with wage growth in certain industries, I do say though, when that keeps a lid on the ability to be undersupplied, right, and then that pushes wages up. But I do think that, employment's going to be a big problem with technology and things like that. And it's, we've always got to be investing in our personal capital, constantly be reskilling. No one's safe in over, the next working career. And I think you've got to always be conscious of that and be doing things to keep improve your own human capital. That's just the nature of the world we live in.
It definitely is. I mean, all of Australia's biggest exports have been things like iron ore, natural gas, coal, of course. But outside of the stuff that gets dug out of the ground, international education is the biggest export for Australia. And then tourism is also a big one, which is in some ways interconnected. So I guess just to wrap up on the housing point, from 2025 to 2028, it's expected that international students will take up approximately 1/4 of Australia's net new housing supply, said the IPA. I think this is just an interesting thing, Chris, the composition of the housing stock. If you look over the next, say, decade, we're going to see more build-to-rent housing, but that's going to be stuff that is not for sale. That's only going to be units that are built for renters. I think that's going to replace what used to be bought by the offshore investors in China, those sort of units that were built specifically for investors. But then we've got international students taking up maybe a quarter of the sort of the net additions to the housing stock. It's not going to leave a whole lot for sale when you look at the different composition. But these things go in a cycle, and it wasn't so many years ago we were talking about a glut. So I suppose you do have the cyclical element to it.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see. I mean, I think dwelling turnover has been reducing for a long time, Pete. The amount of people that as a percentage of trading their property. We used to live in our properties for 7 to 9 years. Now we live in our houses for 14 years in Sydney. And that means that there's less properties for sale each year, which is one of the things that supports prices. I think a lot of people are stuck in their homes. They'd love to upgrade or would love to move to a new city, but stamp duty, selling costs, the getting finance, taking on that additional debt, the fear of getting it wrong, and the costs, to switch houses is actually really expensive. So I think absolutely, I can't see that problem changing. Even if they did things like reduced stamp duty to land tax, ultimately I think that would be baked pretty much quickly into prices. Because new transactions would be new debt creating events, etc. So, I think with dwelling turnover and actual listings on the market is real supply. Supply isn't 11 million dwellings. You can never buy 11 million dwellings on the market. Good luck trying to. At the moment, I think it's 150,000, Pete, on the market. And usually that's been 200, 300, right? And so the actual supply right now is about 150 places you can purchase. And we spoke about it last week. There's a bit of a listings increase. It's not a story we covered this week, but it's got a lot of media this week. CEOs of big real estate companies have been, talking about it. But the context around that is it's not in areas like, the eastern suburbs of Sydney or the northern beaches or the inner west. There has been a little bit increase in the lower north of Sydney, but I would argue that's a lot of investors selling units. But it has been a huge increase in investor hotspots, people who have gone to chase yield and cash flow. And now they're realizing that positive cash flow has gone negative. They realize that they can't afford their house and this investment property. And now it's time to bail on their investment properties. And I think this is a story we'll really track over the next month or two.
That's where the supply is coming from in Australia. I read this week in the US that dwelling turnover there is falling towards just 1% because the Fed has obviously increased the funds rate from basically 0 to 5 in no time. And very different dynamic, though, in the US market. Most people are on 30-year fixed rate mortgages. Now they're around 7% or thereabouts. And it's just gummed up the entire market. I don't think it will be as extreme in Australia because most people are either on variable rate mortgages or short-term fixed rate mortgages. So we don't have those big, long 30-year fixed rates. And for that reason, I don't think we'll see dwelling turnover collapse to anything like the same extent. But it is sort of happening. And as you said, listings have been low, turnover has been low. And what we really need, I guess, is around the world inflation to come right back down. And if interest rates started going the other way, then that would spark activity again. But certainly things have been gummed up, but not maybe quite so much in Australia as in the US.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's if you are on a great 30-year fixed rate of 2% or lower than that, I think they even got. I'm not exactly sure, but they were very cheap. And if you sell this property, you have to take a new mortgage out, and it's at 7% for the next 30 years. Why would you trade, right? But you might want to, you might need to, you need a bigger room and a bigger house, or you don't want to be living in this area. There's a job opportunity, and so that's not great for worker mobility. That's not great for productivity. That's not great for society and livability. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out in the US. I think listings are one thing to really watch, but stock or inventory is another thing to watch. Like if listings go up dramatically, but that gets absorbed by the market in a reasonable fashion, and days on markets don't blow out, and buyers still feel like they haven't got enough choice, well, there's nothing to worry about. But if listings increase and inventory stock on the market starts to increase, buyers start to say, why would I buy now? I'm just going to sit on my hands. They've got a plethora of choice. There's no FOMO. Prices are falling. Why? I'll let the seller come to me. I'll lowball. Lower prices create, if that sold for $330, not $350, prices are falling. I'm going to hold back. I'm going to offer $300. The desperate seller who can't hold on sells for $300. You start to get this negative spiraling event. And that's ultimately like inventory that sits on the market. Then when people have to sell because they're forced to sell, and banks are more likely to, in those situations, when they see the forecast in those markets, banks have the best data in the property world. They can see what people have got from an income point of view, what they're spending, what their cash flow is, what the properties they hold. They get individual, and then they can do that collective data as well. The banks absolutely will go, if we see risks in certain areas, we want to get out of those and minimize our loan losses in these pockets, rather than what they would do in areas where they're not concerned, offer payment holidays, extend interest only. They've got powers. So it's a really, I'm not calling it a doomsday scenario here, but that's what more supply, more inventory sitting on the market that ultimately flips it from a real, seller, into a real buyer's market. And that can be quite dire for prices.
Those people in the US who got their 30-year fixed rate mortgages with a 2 handle, it's got to be one of the greatest inflation hedges, generational opportunity. I was actually flicking through my docs this week, and I saw we fixed a mortgage at 2% for 5 years in the UK, but you just can't get those really long mortgage terms in Australia or United Kingdom. They're just different setup. And I think in some ways it's a strength for Australia. There's monetary policy can be more powerful and more effective more quickly because most people are on variable rates, or at the very least those shorter term fixed rate mortgages. So I think that's about it for this week, Chris. Thanks everyone so much for tuning in. Always do send us your property questions. There's a link in the show notes, or if you just want to say hello, you can catch me at my daily blog, Pete Wargent on Blogspot, or at Pete Wargent on Twitter. And if you're interested in buying property in Brisbane, we're the people to see. And you should always subscribe for the Rask podcast, of course, on your favourite podcast player or on the YouTube channel. And Chris, if people want to have a chat to you about mortgages at Blusk, where should they go to for more? Just in the show notes. If you've been listening for a while, you probably know that by now. Pete's blog, definitely be jumping on that as well. And definitely try to come to any of the road shows if you've got the ability to in any of the cities. Pete's going to a bunch. I'm going to a bunch as well. And there'll be good times. I've got the Hawaiian shirt ready, and take it easy on the futsal, Chris. We need you in full working order for the roadshow, so no broken wrists in the meantime. That's right. So, enjoy your week, and we'll see you next episode. Cheers. Happy Sunday.